History books present Adolf Hitler as a calculating dictator who orchestrated humanity's darkest chapter. They examine his political rise, military strategies, and systematic elimination of millions. However, they rarely discuss the bizarre private man behind the public image. By 1945, Hitler's hands trembled so violently that he could barely sign his name. He lived in an underground bunker, breathing stale air. Avoiding sunlight for weeks at a time, his personal physician administered injections derived from animal extracts multiple times daily. Meanwhile, he kept his study at 11 degrees Celsius while generals shivered through hours-long conferences. He employed 15 young women whose sole purpose was tasting his food before every meal. Yet this same man refused to consume meat out of compassion for animals. In fact, he passed some of Europe's strictest animal protection laws. He was extremely upset when his German shepherd passed away, but showed no emotion when signing orders that determined millions of fates. Therefore, Hitler's private world contained peculiar dietary restrictions, questionable medical treatments, and psychological contradictions that history textbooks ignore. These strange habits and obsessions reveal vulnerabilities that shaped his decision-making during critical moments. What follows exposes the hidden Hitler, the unusual behaviors, compulsions, and physical deterioration that define the man behind the carefully constructed propaganda image. Section 1. The Vegetarian Dictator. Hitler's relationship with food was complicated, contradictory, and deeply strange. Understanding what he ate and why reveals important aspects of his psychology and physical health. His dietary choices became propaganda tools while also reflecting genuine medical problems and personal obsessions. The Nazi leader was not always vegetarian. During his youth and early political career throughout the 1920s, he enjoyed traditional Bavarian cuisine. Historical accounts mention his fondness for sausages and liver dumplings during this period. Even after becoming chancellor in 1933, he continued eating meat at state banquets for several more years. However, something changed as the decade progressed. Throughout the mid-1930s, the Führer began experiencing severe stomach problems. During the Rhineland crisis in 1936, he suffered attacks that left him doubled over in pain. The symptoms were varied and constant. Stomach cramps occurred regularly, while excessive gas and bloating became persistent problems. His physicians grew increasingly concerned about these digestive episodes, particularly as they intensified during moments of political stress. By 1937, his dietary habits had already begun shifting noticeably. Consider the state dinner with Mussolini in Munich that year. Historical accounts describe the German leader hosting a lavish meal, which included caviar, fish, and meat courses for guests. Yet he barely ate anything himself. Instead, he lectured Mussolini on the benefits of vegetarianism throughout the evening. Witnesses noted his plate had special vegetarian dishes prepared separately, while he toasted with non-alcoholic beverages as others drank wine around the table. This incident foreshadowed a transformation that would define the rest of his life. By 1938, under doctors' advice, the dictator eliminated meat entirely from his diet. His physicians believed a bland diet would provide relief from his worsening digestive problems. The timing is important here because his vegetarianism was not primarily about beliefs in its origins. Instead, medical necessity driven by chronic discomfort pushed this change. During the following years, however, something shifted in his thinking about these dietary choices. His typical meals became simple and bland throughout this period. He woke late, around 10 in the morning, and had a light breakfast. Coffee with milk, bread, and marmalade comprised his morning meal, with nothing heavy or complicated. For lunch and dinner, his table featured steamed vegetables prepared to strict specifications. Carrots, peas, and cauliflower appeared regularly, along with baked potatoes served with pureed beans. Soups made from rice or lentils became staples of his diet. Many dishes were pureed or mashed, partly because of digestive problems and partly because his teeth were deteriorating as the years progressed. Chewing became increasingly difficult, which further limited his food choices. Despite these restrictions, Hitler particularly enjoyed certain dishes. creamed spinach appeared frequently on his table. Pureed peas became a standard offering. Baked potatoes with curd cheese and unrefined linseed oil formed a combination that sounds unappealing to most people. Yet he had what his staff described as a peculiar passion for that linseed oil. Yet despite avoiding meat, the German leader had a notorious sweet tooth throughout this entire period. He adored cakes and pastries with remarkable enthusiasm. Reports indicate he sometimes consumed multiple cream cakes in one sitting, particularly during evening gatherings. He loved chocolates and frequently requested them between meals. Apple cake became a favorite, especially freshly baked versions served warm. This contradicts the image of strict dietary discipline, as he indulged his sugar cravings freely and without restraint throughout the war years. Meanwhile, his staff noticed increasingly strange behaviors around mealtime. One of the dictator's food tasters later described the menu in detail. Margot Welk recalled white asparagus, wonderful fruits, peppers, and cauliflower served during her time in this position, all strictly vegetarian and often gourmet in preparation. Even during wartime rationing, the Reich's leader had access to lavish vegetarian ingredients. The quality remained high, even if the variety was limited throughout the conflict. The contrast with his guests was stark during this period. Military officers and government officials dined on roast chicken or sausage when available at the same table. Meanwhile, the Führer ate his vegetables, maintaining his restrictive diet despite the stomach problems that plagued him. During the early 1940s, Nazi propaganda actively promoted the Führer's diet to the German public. Children's magazines told kids about his eating habits to idolize him during this period. One publication stated directly that he did not eat meat because of his love for the world of animals. This was constructed on purpose to create a saintly image. The leader as the savior of animals. Germans were encouraged to see his dietary discipline as proof of dedication and virtue to the nation. By 1942, however, his relationship with food had transformed into something far darker. From 1942 until his final days in 1945, the German dictator fully embraced vegetarianism as an identity rather than a mere medical necessity. He began describing himself as strictly vegetarian and lectured others about the moral superiority of avoiding meat with increasing frequency. The practical health measure transformed into a personal philosophy during these years. The Nazi leader came to see his diet as evidence of his advanced thinking and compassion, which he believed set him apart from others around him. He often suggested vegetarianism represented civilization's progress during conversations. In private discussions during this period, he proposed that after the war, he intended to enforce vegetarian principles more widely across German society. He believed it was purer and more aligned with his vision, drawing on Richard Wagner's mystical notions that a vegetarian diet was part of a superior lifestyle. He mentioned Leonardo da Vinci frequently, implying that avoiding meat was a mark of genius or higher compassion, and this self-image fed his ego considerably. The terrible irony, of course, is that this moral superiority regarding animals coincided with systematic policies of destruction toward humans he labeled as enemies. He passed strict animal protection laws during the 1930s, forbidding cruelty to creatures, even as his regime committed systematic violence against people throughout Europe. This contradiction reveals deep distortions in his moral reasoning. Starting around 1942, as the war turned against Germany, his paranoia reached new extremes. The Führer's fear of being poisoned through food became overwhelming during this period. He employed a team of 15 young women as food tasters, who were required to sample every dish prepared before he would eat. Only after time passed with no ill effects would the same food be served to him. The process happened before every single meal without exception throughout the remaining war years. Margot Welk and others lived in terror throughout their service in this role. They cried before meals, fearing each bite might be their last during the uncertain war period. This illustrates the dictator's paranoia level with striking clarity. Every single meal was preceded by someone else risking their life for him. He could never simply enjoy food after this system was in place. He always waited to see if his tasters would collapse, with the wait time sometimes lasting 30 minutes or more between their tasting and his eating. His kitchen became a strictly controlled environment during this period. Only his most trusted cook prepared meals under constant supervision. Ingredients came from known suppliers, often from vegetables grown in gardens he personally approved before planting. All water and produce might be tested for safety before reaching the kitchen. These procedures underline how obsessive the regime was about protecting the leader's food supply throughout the remaining war years. Another incident from 1942 demonstrates how deep this paranoia ran. During a military conference lunch that year, one general teased the Führer by saying the sausages on the table were vegetarian grain sausages. He reportedly turned pale with concern until reassured that no meat was present in the dish. Even a joke about his food could trigger visible anxiety by this point in the war. Throughout the war years, his obsession with diet and animal welfare remained constant. Yet his strange relationship with food was only one piece of a larger pattern. His entire daily existence had become trapped within rigid rituals and numbing routines that revealed a man increasingly isolated from reality. Section 2. The Prisoner of Routine. Adolf Hitler's daily life at Obersalzberg revealed a man increasingly trapped within his own peculiar rituals. What appeared to outsiders as the mountain retreat of a contemplative statesman was, in reality, a theater of enforced boredom where the Nazi leader's inner circle endured numbing hours of repetition and emptiness. Throughout the mid-1930s, as the Reich consolidated power, the Führer established a rigid daily pattern that would persist for years. The dictator typically appeared in the lower rooms late in the morning, around 11 o'clock. After briefly reviewing press summaries and receiving reports from Martin Bormann, the day's actual centerpiece began with a prolonged afternoon dinner. Guests assembled in the anteroom while the German leader selected which lady he would escort to the table. The meal itself, though featuring simple food consisting of soup, a meat course, and dessert, stretched interminably as the Führer dominated conversation. Dinner was merely the opening act of a daily performance that trapped everyone present. By 4:30 in the afternoon, when most government officials would be concluding their workday, the mountain retreat's guests were only beginning their ordeal. The ritual walk to the tea house commenced as a procession with security men at the head, the Nazi leader conversing with a chosen companion, and the rest of the company following in order, with more guards bringing up the rear. The walk took about half an hour. At the tea house itself, the company settled into easy chairs around a round table for approximately 2 hours. According to Albert Speer, who endured countless such afternoons, the dictator was particularly fond of drifting into endless monologues. The subjects were mostly familiar to the company, who therefore listened absently while pretending attention. Sometimes the Führer himself fell asleep during his own monologues. The company would continue chatting in whispers, hoping he would wake in time for the evening meal. Around 6 o'clock, the procession reversed itself, returning to the Berghof. The Reich's leader would withdraw to his upper rooms while the retinue scattered, only to reassemble 2 hours later for supper. This represented a complete repetition of the afternoon's ritual. After supper, the Nazi leader led his unchanged company into the salon for what Speer called the second part of the evening. The routine was invariable, with movies lasting as many as 3 or 4 hours. The lights slowly dimmed as household employees and members of the bodyguard filed in through a rear door to watch. The architect recalled that they sat mute for some 3 or 4 hours, and when these films came to an end at about 1 in the morning, everyone stood up stiff and dazed. The German leader alone seemed sprightly afterward. He would discourse on the actors' performances, then continue conversation at a sluggish pace in the small drawing room while beer, wine, and sandwiches were served. The Führer typically said good night around 2 o'clock in the morning. This meant the working day that had begun at 11 had consisted primarily of meals, walks, tea, more meals, and movies. Speer described the cumulative effect with striking clarity. In the early hours of the morning, guests went home dead tired, exhausted from doing nothing. After a few days of this routine, the architect was seized by what he called the mountain disease. He felt exhausted and vacant from the constant waste of time. The choice of films revealed the dictator's taste for escape rather than substance. He preferred light entertainment, love, and society films, particularly reviews with lots of leg display. He showed no feeling for comedies featuring Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. Sports and mountaineering films were shown very rarely. Animal and landscape movies and travelogues never appeared. Many films were shown twice or more, though interestingly, never those with tragic plots. When the war began, the Nazi leader gave up evening film showings, claiming he wanted to renounce his favorite entertainment out of sympathy for the privations of the soldiers. Instead, records were played, but the pattern remained identical. The same music repeated endlessly, with the Führer insisting on a few bravura selections from Wagnerian operas to be followed promptly with operettas. The relentless monotony served a subtle but powerful purpose. As a favored permanent guest at Obersalzberg, Speer could not withdraw from these evenings without appearing impolite. Dr. Otto Dietrich, the press chief, ventured to slip away to performances at the Salzburg Festival a few times, but in doing so he incurred the dictator's anger. The only escape was flight to Berlin. During the Reich's leader's longer stays at Obersalzberg, the only way to save oneself was to flee to Berlin. This explained why his closest associates conspicuously avoided the mountain retreat. These close associates, who could frequently be met at afternoon dinners in the Chancellery, obviously avoided Obersalzberg Goebbels, Franz Schwarz, the party treasurer, and Hermann Esser turned up only 2 or 3 times during Speer's years there. Even Hess, who should have had every reason to check the activities of his deputy Bormann, appeared only 2 or 3 times. The Führer himself noticed and puzzled over these absences. He showed considerable pleasure when they turned up, and frequently asked them to come often and to stay longer. However, his paladins had meanwhile become the centers of their own circles. It was therefore rather uncomfortable for them to submit to the dictator's altogether different routine and to his manner, which, in spite of all his charm, was painfully self-assertive. Despite the enforced intimacy of these daily rituals, a genuine human connection eluded the German leader entirely. Speer, who spent more time with him than almost anyone, reflected years later that never in his life had he met a person who so seldom revealed his feelings. If the Nazi leader did so, he instantly locked them away again. During his imprisonment in Spandau, Speer discussed this peculiarity with Rudolf Hess. Both of them agreed that there had been moments when they felt they had come close to him. Nevertheless, they were invariably disillusioned. If either of them ventured a slightly more personal tone, the Führer promptly put up an unbreakable wall. Even the dictator's use of the familiar "du" proved hollow. Hess recalled that after 1933, the Reich's leader found pretexts to reintroduce the formal "Sie" with Hermann Esser, avoided Christian Weber, treated Julius Streicher impersonally, and had Ernst Röhm killed. Even toward Eva Braun, he was never completely relaxed and human, Speer observed. The gulf between the leader of the nation and the simple girl was always maintained. The emotional distance manifested in strange ways. Once, during tea time at Obersalzberg, the Nazi leader began staring at Speer in what became a bizarre dominance contest. The architect took it as a challenge. He had to muster almost inhuman strength, seemingly forever, not to yield to the ever-mounting urge to look away. This continued until the Führer suddenly closed his eyes and shortly afterward turned to the woman at his side. Speer wrestled with understanding this emptiness. Sometimes he asked himself why he could not call the German leader his friend. The architect spent endless time with him, was almost at home in his private circle, and moreover was his foremost associate in his favorite field. Everything was missing. If the Reich's leader found human connection impossible, he found escape in architectural fantasies. By 1936, between the official buildings of the Reich Chancellery and Speer's office, the dictator had doors installed in walls and a communicating path laid out so he could reach the model city undisturbed. Sometimes he invited the supper guests to the studio. They would set out armed with flashlights and keys. In the empty halls, spotlights illuminated the models. In this realm, the Führer transformed. There was no need for Speer to do the talking. The Nazi leader, with flashing eyes, explained every single detail to his companions. The models were elaborate, made by cabinet makers on a scale of 1 to 50 with wood painted to simulate actual materials. The model street stretched about 100 feet through the former exhibition rooms of the Berlin Academy of Arts. The German leader was particularly excited over a large model of the Grand Boulevard on a scale of 1 to 1,000. He loved to enter his avenue at various points and take measure of the future effect. To achieve the proper perspective, he bent down, almost kneeling, his eye an inch or so above the level of the model. While looking, he spoke with unusual vivacity. Speer recognized the significance of these moments. These were the rare times when the dictator relinquished his usual stiffness. In no other situation did the architect see him so lively, so spontaneous, so relaxed. One associate captured the peculiarity by observing that Speer was the Führer's unrequited love. The architectural obsession dominated the Reich's leader's schedule. His rare appointments in the late afternoon were imperiled by his passion for looking at building plans. Adjutants would plead with Speer not to show any plans on particular days. However, the Nazi leader would see through the ruse and himself go to look in the anteroom or the cloakroom for the architect's roll of plans. Sessions could last until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, with the dictator studying every detail. By 1940, nothing revealed the German leader's disconnection from reality more starkly than his architectural obsessions during wartime. On June 25, 1940, the day of the armistice with France, the Führer issued a decree stating that Berlin was to be given the style matching with the greatness of victory. He further declared that he regarded the accomplishment of these supremely vital constructive tasks for the Reich as the greatest step in the preservation of victory. The decree ordered full-scale resumption of work on the Berlin buildings. Throughout 1941, even as German forces struggled in Russia, the Reich's leader remained fixated on his grandiose building schemes. When Speer proposed in July of that year, as the German advance in Russia proceeded, that work be suspended on all buildings not essential for the war effort, Dr. Traudl demurred. The engineer thought that in view of the present favorable state of military operations, they could wait a few weeks more. The dictator refused to hear of any restrictions whatsoever. The absurdity escalated during the autumn of 1941. In mid-September, when the advance in Russia was already lagging considerably behind the overconfident forecasts, the Nazi leader ordered sizable increases in contracts for granite purchases from Sweden, Norway, and Finland. Contracts worth 30 million Reichsmarks were awarded to stone companies across occupied Europe. To transport these quantities, they founded their own fleet and set up shipyards, planning to build 1,000 cargo boats. On November 29, 1941, with the outlines of winter disaster becoming apparent, the Führer told Speer bluntly that the building must begin, even while this war was still going on. He was not going to let the war keep him from accomplishing his plans. On August 20, 1941, the German leader had ordered that 200 pieces of captured heavy artillery be reserved for display on granite pedestals along his Grand Boulevard. Meanwhile, behind the Russian front, catastrophe loomed. The German military organization had failed to cope with the Russian winter. Soviet troops had systematically destroyed all locomotive sheds, watering stations, and technical apparatus of the railroad system during their retreat. Hospital trains sat stalled with wounded freezing to death inside. Troops were cut off by snow and cold in villages and hamlets. Speer proposed assigning 30,000 of his 65,000 construction workers to repair work on the railroads. Incredibly, it was 2 weeks before the Reich's leader could bring himself to authorize this. On December 27, 1941, he at last issued the order. Instead of deploying construction crews at the beginning of November, the dictator had gone on with his triumphal buildings, determined not to capitulate in any way to reality. Dr. Fritz Taut, who had just returned from inspecting the Eastern Front, was deeply depressed. He told Speer that Germans were physically incapable of enduring such hardships and psychologically doomed to destruction in Russia. It was a struggle in which the primitive people would prove superior. They could endure everything, including the harshness of the climate. Germans were too sensitive and were bound to be defeated. Yet on that same day, December 27, 1941, the Nazi leader divided responsibility for railroad repair in Russia between Tott's organization and Speer's construction teams. German soldiers continued to freeze and starve because supplies could not reach them. Yet the Führer's mind remained occupied with monuments and boulevards. What remains striking is the contrast between the German leader's image and reality. To the German people, he was the leader who watched over the nation day and night. The propaganda portrayed ceaseless vigilance and iron discipline. The truth, as Speer observed, was altogether different. The dictator's lax scheduling could be regarded as a lifestyle characteristic of the artistic temperament. Speer noticed that the Reich's leader often allowed a problem to mature during the weeks when he seemed entirely taken up with trivial matters. Then, after the sudden insight came, he would spend a few days of intensive work giving final shape to his solution. The dinner and supper gatherings served as sounding boards where the Führer could try out new ideas, approaching these ideas in a succession of different ways, tinkering with them before an uncritical audience, and thus perfecting them. Nevertheless, the cost was staggering. Hours, days, weeks were squandered in meaningless routine while a nation fought for survival. The man who demanded total sacrifice from millions could not sacrifice his architectural fantasies even as the Reich burned. At Obersalzberg, in the model rooms, and at the planning sessions that stretched past midnight, the Nazi leader remained completely under the sway of his building dreams, as disconnected from reality as he was from genuine human feeling. The prisoner of routine had imprisoned an entire nation in his delusions, building monuments in his mind while real cities turned to ash. Yet while his mind wandered through architectural fantasies, his body was failing in ways that would prove nearly as destructive. Section 3. The Questionable Doctor. The German leader's medical history is one of the strangest aspects of his private life. For nearly a decade, he relied on a physician whose treatments ranged from conventional to bizarre to potentially dangerous. Dr. Theodor Morell became his most trusted medical advisor, administering thousands of injections and dozens of different medications. This reveals how the dictator's health problems, combined with unconventional medical methods, may have influenced critical wartime decision-making. Even during the 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazi leader was obsessed with his health. He frequently spoke of fearing an early death, influenced by family tragedies that shaped his anxiety about mortality. His mother had passed away from a serious illness in 1907 when he was 18 years old. This loss deeply affected him throughout his life. His father had also passed away relatively young. These family experiences fed his constant worry about his own survival. During this early period, he experienced periodic ailments, including chronic sore throats, sinus infections, and the digestive troubles already discussed. He took pills for gas and drank teas for nerves regularly. By the time he became chancellor in 1933, the Führer was already collecting doctors. He would consult multiple physicians for minor issues repeatedly. This behavior suggests excessive worry about illness that leads to constant medical seeking. He rarely traveled without his medicine cabinet, believing himself almost incapable of survival without pills and treatments. One specific fear haunted him throughout his adult life. The terror that he would develop the same illness that took his mother consumed his thoughts relentlessly. Any stomach pain or symptom made him worry it was this disease developing. This fear made him extremely receptive to doctors who promised cures or preventive treatments. He would try almost anything if it might ward off the disease he most dreaded. However, his usual physicians did not fully satisfy his demands for immediate relief. He wanted quick fixes and constant attention rather than conservative treatment approaches. This created an opening for someone willing to provide precisely what he sought. That person was Dr. Theodor Morell. Theodor Morell was not a renowned specialist or professor of medicine. He was a general practitioner with a thriving Berlin practice treating celebrities for skin conditions and other ailments. He had unconventional ideas about medicine, claiming to have studied with famous biologist Eli Metchnikoff regarding beneficial bacteria. The medical establishment viewed him with considerable suspicion and skepticism. Morell met the German leader through personal connections in late 1936. The dictator's photographer Heinrich Hoffmann and Eva Braun's mother both had ailments that Morell treated successfully during this period. They enthusiastically recommended him during a time when the Führer suffered severe bowel distress and eczema on his legs. He invited Morell to examine him around this time. Morell's diagnosis was complete exhaustion of the intestinal system, essentially an imbalance of gut bacteria, causing cramps and skin problems. He prescribed vitamins, liver extracts, and a special preparation of intestinal bacteria. Notably, Morell gave his new patient capsules containing bacterial cultures, reportedly derived from sources known for promoting longevity. This was an early form of treatment involving beneficial bacteria, though Morell's methods were far from scientifically rigorous. Within months during early 1937, the Nazi leader experienced dramatic improvement. The severe stomach spasms that had plagued him for years largely disappeared, while the eczema on his legs cleared up completely by mid-1937. He felt vigorous again and could eat without crippling pain for the first time in years. Where others had failed, Morell had delivered remarkable results. The German dictator was overjoyed by this transformation. He proclaimed that Morell had saved his life during this period. In 1937, he appointed Morell as his personal physician, dismissing the skeptics around him. To others, he explained that no one had ever told him precisely what was wrong before, and Morell's method seemed logical to him. His unwavering trust in this physician was evident from the beginning. When other doctors later warned that Morell's treatments might be harmful, the Führer retorted that he had saved him when no one else could manage his symptoms. The problem became apparent quickly. Everyone around the Reich's leader despised Morell intensely, with other physicians finding his hygiene poor and his treatment suspect. Top Nazi officials like Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring were disgusted by him, sarcastically calling him the Reich injection master behind his back. However, the dictator's personal gratitude shielded Morell completely from criticism, and he would not hear any negative comments about his doctor. This isolated him within a bubble of one medical opinion with no effective oversight from other qualified physicians. Once Morell took charge in 1937, the daily routine increasingly included medication at every turn. By 1943, a typical day at Führer headquarters involved substantial intake of various substances. The morning began late, often with grogginess and digestive discomfort. Morell would greet his patient with a handful of pills. In Traudl Junge's memoir, she describes how at least 5 different pills accompanied breakfast or immediately followed it. One to stimulate appetite, one for digestion, one to prevent gas, one as a laxative, and perhaps one for nerves. Morell also gave daily injections of a multivitamin mixture his patient called his Vitamultine shot. Unbeknownst to the Führer initially, by 1942, this injection was enhanced with a powerful stimulant that provided artificial energy. He felt alert and energetic after these shots, which allowed him to maintain his demanding schedule throughout the war. During the afternoon hours, a predictable pattern emerged. The German leader often experienced energy crashes late in the day, common for users of such stimulants. Morell would respond with another injection, sometimes glucose combined with hormones or even a small stimulant dose if important meetings were scheduled. The goal was to keep his patient functional and energetic throughout demanding conferences and decision-making sessions. Evening brought different challenges. The Reich's leader was anxious and had trouble winding down from his activities. His nocturnal lifestyle and racing thoughts made sleep difficult consistently. Morell administered strong sleeping pills at night to induce rest. The Führer was effectively on stimulants by day and sedatives by night. Over time, the frequency increased substantially. Initially, perhaps 1 injection daily, but by 1944, he received injections multiple times per day. Based on Albert Speer's observations, the injections had to be given more and more frequently as tolerance built up in his system. Records and research reveal a stunning array of substances administered during this period. Stimulants formed a key part of the Wiedermoltin shots. These substances were widely used in the German army, with millions of tablets issued to soldiers to stay awake during combat operations. The dictator partook as well, likely explaining episodes of hyperactivity during meetings. After receiving a shot, he could deliver furious speeches lasting 2 to 3 hours without pause. His meeting with Mussolini in July 1943, where he talked non-stop for hours, was possibly fueled by these stimulants based on observers' accounts. The Nazi leader also received strong pain medications for suffering stomach cramps and later injuries. Following the assassination attempt on July 20, 1944, when a bomb blast injured him, Morell treated the pain with powerful substances. Prolonged use made the patient likely dependent on these medications, and when the effect wore off, he experienced jitteriness, anxiety, and muscle pain, which are classic withdrawal symptoms. Despite his injuries, he appeared remarkably indifferent to pain when doctors removed shrapnel from his body, likely operating under the influence of the pain medications Morell had administered. Morell also injected his patient with hormones and extracts that alarmed other physicians. Male hormones derived from animal sources were administered regularly. Morell told the dictator's secretary that he was giving injections from bulls to provide energy. These were given before important events or visits to Eva Braun, presumably to boost vitality. Additionally, infusions of heart and liver extracts from animals were administered under the idea of invigorating various organs. Other treatments included applying leeches to his temples to improve circulation when headaches were reported. This old-fashioned remedy was still part of Morell's approach during the war years. The Führer took special pills for stomach gas, which notably contained small amounts of strychnine and belladonna. Taken in quantity, these substances could cause serious complications. He also received drops for his sinuses occasionally. In historian David Irving's compilation of Morell's medical diaries, records show that Hitler consumed over 70 different medications in pill or injection form during his time with the physician. By 1944, the effects of Morell's treatment regimen were becoming increasingly visible to those around the Führer. Eyewitnesses in 1945 describe a man transformed beyond recognition. He appeared old, gray, and exhausted, with glassy eyes and shaking limbs during this final period. Contrast this with newsreels from 1939, where he appeared relatively robust and energetic. The difference is stark and shocking. By 1945, the Nazi leader at age 56 appeared decades older than his actual years. With constant influence from various substances, his mood swung wildly during this period. He could be lethargic and apathetic in mornings, perhaps from medication effects, then burst into frenzied energy after an injection. He grew increasingly irritable, suspicious, and detached from reality as the conflict intensified. Some contemporaries noticed that after 1942, he stopped making long, coherent public speeches and rarely appeared publicly. This was possibly due to health issues and his erratic condition from the treatment regimen. There were instances of him fainting or almost collapsing during late 1944. He had episodes of dizziness and weakness where he had to lie down during conferences. These were likely side effects of withdrawal or excessive dosing. This had to be kept secret from the German public and military. Official reports would claim he had the flu when such episodes occurred. Constant injections and stress ravaged his immunity during this period. He suffered frequent colds and lingering jaundice throughout 1944. Morell responded with more substances, including excessive glucose, which can fuel infections rather than help them. The Führer developed dental problems and sinus infections that never fully healed despite treatment. By this stage, absolute dependence on his physician had developed. Hitler could not function without his doctor present. In her memoir, Traudl Junge observed that he would not start his day until Morell administered shots. He anxiously asked his doctor if he felt weak at any point. Morell had to be near constantly throughout the final years. The famous endurance, like staying up for days during military crises, was now purely maintained through chemical means. The irony is obvious now. The Führer, who prided himself on self-control, was essentially dependent on multiple substances, enabled by Morell throughout the war. This was a tightly kept secret from the public and even many officials. Had the Allies known the extent of his physical frailty, they might have seen strategic opportunities. Even many in his military did not fully realize how incapacitated he was becoming during critical decision-making periods. Historians continue debating Morell's ultimate impact on events. Some argue he prolonged the dictator's ability to lead Germany without stimulants. He might have completely broken down by 1942 or 1943. Morell managed symptoms enough to keep him functioning, for better or worse. In that sense, these treatments sustained the regime's head longer than natural health would have allowed. Others argue Morell hastened the decline substantially. The substances possibly made strategic errors worse during the war. Stubborn military stands or refusal to retreat at critical moments might have been influenced by overconfidence or impaired judgment from stimulant effects. Additionally, by late war, he was often detached or lost in thought during meetings, perhaps due to medication side effects affecting his reasoning. In September 1944, a palace intrigue erupted that threatened Morell's position. Dr. Erwin Giesing, an ear specialist, noticed his patient taking 16 anti-gas pills daily during treatment. These pills contained strychnine and atropine. In small amounts, Giesing calculated that this approach could potentially lead to dangerous levels of these substances. He experimented on himself and experienced similar symptoms, including light sensitivity and increased thirst. Giesing and other doctors, including Karl Brandt, seized this as a chance to remove Morell from his position. They wrote a memo accusing Morell of systematically poisoning their patient through excessive dosing. However, the intrigue backfired completely. When the German leader learned of it, he was furious, not at Morell, but at the accusers themselves. He defended his physician absolutely, stating that Morell was and would remain his doctor. He had complete faith in him regardless of what others claimed. The Führer even had the Gestapo investigate whether Morell was attempting to do harm intentionally. Himmler concluded it was unlikely after the investigation. Ultimately, Brandt and Giesing were dismissed from their positions, while Morell remained in favor. Based on historian David Irving's analysis of the medical records, later examinations showed the accusations were exaggerated significantly. The strychnine dosage was within medically safe limits. The dictator likely had infectious hepatitis causing symptoms, not strychnine poisoning. However, the episode illustrated his blind loyalty to Morell and his unwillingness to hear medical criticism from anyone. By April 1945, in the Führerbunker in Berlin, the situation had become dire. The Nazi leader's health was at its worst state. His hand shook constantly without control as he moved with difficulty around the bunker, emotionally unstable. He would fly into rages or sink into apathy unpredictably, though Morell continued to attend him and offer injections as before. Even his patient finally began to doubt the treatments. On April 21, 1945, with Soviet shells falling on Berlin, a dramatic break occurred. The German dictator finally dismissed Dr. Morell after 9 years of unwavering trust. Based on various accounts, he suddenly became paranoid, suspecting Morell wanted to sedate him so generals could remove him from Berlin against his will. He shouted at Morell to remove his uniform, put on plain clothes, and return to being a regular doctor. After nearly a decade of complete trust, he cast Morell aside at the very end. Morell left the bunker in tears, carrying suitcases of unused medicines with him. The Führer survived only about a week after dismissing Morell, before ending his own life as Soviet forces closed in withdrawal. And pain may have struck him in those final days without Morell's substances, or perhaps it mattered little given the collapse of everything around him. Morell was later captured by American forces during the occupation. They ultimately released him after questioning, but he was a broken man by this point. He passed away in 1948, in poor health himself, suffering from obesity and heart trouble. Ironically, these were some of the same issues he had treated his most famous patient for during the war. The dictator's dependency on Dr. Morell and his questionable treatments extended far beyond physical ailments. His private life was filled with obsessions and compulsions that few outsiders ever witnessed. These strange behaviors would reveal far more about the man behind the carefully constructed public image. Section 4. Private obsessions and peculiar habits. The peculiar patterns that defined Adolf Hitler's daily existence extended far beyond his diet and medical dependencies. His relationships, habits, and obsessions revealed a man increasingly detached from normal human experience, living according to rules that made sense only within the closed world he had created. By 1933, even as the Nazi leader consolidated power and crowds cheered him throughout Germany, he systematically distanced himself from those who had known him longest. The old Munich comrades, who had shared the party's early struggles and considered themselves his trusted friends, found themselves increasingly excluded from his presence. These men had shown him devoted loyalty for years, yet now the Führer avoided them whenever possible. When one of the old comrades wanted to speak with him, he almost always managed to refuse or delay such requests on all sorts of pretexts. The reason became clear to those who observed closely. These longtime associates did not always assume the tone of respectful distance that the German leader, for all the geniality he outwardly displayed, now thought proper. They adopted an air of unseemly familiarity, supposing they had earned the right to such intimacy. This no longer comported with the historical role the dictator had assigned himself. On extremely rare occasions, he might still pay a visit to one or another of them, but these occasions grew fewer with each passing year. The annual reunion on November 9th, commemorating the failed putsch of 1923, became an ordeal the Nazi leader visibly dreaded. Surprisingly, he did not look forward to these gatherings. It was clear that he found it distasteful to have to be present. The men who had once been comrades were now reminders of a past he preferred to forget, a time before destiny had elevated him beyond the reach of ordinary friendship. Even in matters closest to his heart, the Reich's leader maintained elaborate pretenses that served no apparent purpose. His relationship with Eva Braun epitomized this strange pattern. A small Mercedes sedan would drive up to Obersalzberg with his 2 secretaries and a simple Munich girl who was pleasant and fresh-faced rather than beautiful. This was Eva Braun, yet this sedan was never allowed to drive in the official motorcade. No one was to connect it with the Führer. The secretaries served the function of disguising the mistress's presence. The German leader and Eva Braun avoided anything that might suggest an intimate relationship, only to go upstairs to the bedrooms together late at night. This needless, forced practice of keeping their distance continued even in the inner circle, whose members could not help being aware of the truth. Eva Braun kept her distance from everyone in the dictator's circle, a reserved manner that many interpreted as haughtiness but was merely embarrassment. She remained well aware of her dubious position in his court. Throughout the 1930s, as the Reich expanded and triumphs mounted, the Nazi leader's public image required careful cultivation. His propaganda chief Goebbels shaped every aspect of how the German people perceived their Führer, including details so trivial they bordered on absurd. When a delegation of Berlin women's organizations planned to welcome the dictator at Anhalter station and present him with flowers, the head of the organization called the propaganda ministry to ask what his favorite flower was. After telephoning around and asking the adjutants, they received no answer. He had no favorite flower. The ministry official reflected for a while, then decided they should say Edelweiss. The rare alpine flower sounded right, coming as it did from the Bavarian mountains. From then on, the Edelweiss was officially declared the Führer's flower. The incident showed how much Liberty Party propaganda took in shaping the German leader's image, creating preferences and characteristics where none existed. The dictator's relationship with art revealed similar delusions. He thought himself a connoisseur with impeccable taste, yet his judgments often betrayed limited understanding. One of his favorite painters was Eduard Grützner, whose pictures of tipsy monks and inebriated butlers seemed hardly the right sort of thing for a teetotaler. However, the Nazi leader regarded these paintings solely from their artistic aspect. He would examine a Grützner work and declare it greatly underrated, insisting the painter was a steal at the current market price. The Führer genuinely believed Grützner would someday be worth as much as Rembrandt. He compared the situation to Rembrandt himself, who counted for nothing for decades after his death, when his pictures were practically given away. In his view, Grützner simply had not been discovered yet, but time would reveal his genius. Later, when a forger exploited this fondness for another painter named Spitzweg, the German leader became uneasy about which of his paintings were genuine. He quickly repressed these doubts and commented maliciously about the fakes hanging in his photographer's collection. though he said this should remain secret to preserve the man's pleasure. For all his interest in static art, the Reich's leader found his greatest escape in motion pictures. Every evening during the pre-war years, a crude movie projector was set up to show the newsreel and one or two movies. The choice of films was discussed with Goebbels, and usually they were the same ones being shown in Berlin movie houses at the time. The dictator preferred light entertainment, love, and society films. All films with certain actors had to be procured as quickly as possible. Reviews with lots of leg display were sure to please him. The German leader frequently watched foreign films, including those withheld from the German public. Sports and mountaineering films were shown very rarely. Animal and landscape movies and travelogues never appeared. He also had no feeling for comedies featuring Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. German movie production was not nearly sufficient to fill the quota of 2 new movies every day. Many were therefore shown twice, or even more often, though interestingly, never those with tragic plots. The ones seen more than once were frequently spectaculars or movies with his favorite actors. This habit of seeing 1 or 2 films every evening continued until the beginning of the war. The Nazi leader's superstitious nature manifested in ways both subtle and striking. On October 15, 1933, he had solemnly laid the cornerstone for the House of German Art in Munich, delivering the ceremonial hammer blows with a fine silver hammer specially designed for the occasion. The hammer broke during the ceremony. The Führer remarked afterward that when that hammer shattered, he knew at once it was an evil omen. Something was going to happen, he thought. 4 months later, his architect Traudl passed away. The German leader said they now knew why the hammer broke, as the architect had been destined to die. This was not idle talk. He genuinely believed in such portents and referenced them repeatedly in the years that followed. The most revealing relationships in the Nazi leader's life involved not humans but a German shepherd named Blondie. Some close associates, particularly Joseph Goebbels, believed the dog was more important to him than any human being. The Führer trained Blondie extensively throughout the war years. She could jump through hoops, climb ladders, sit up and beg on a platform, and balance on narrow poles. He was delighted when Blondie broke her jumping record by even a few centimeters, or could balance for a couple of minutes longer than usual. He said he relaxed best in his dog's company, which suggests the animal provided emotional comfort he could not find elsewhere. In hot weather, the only reason the German leader would go for walks was for the sake of Blondie. People would gather outside designated areas to watch him play with and train his dog. He derived genuine joy from these training sessions, perhaps more than from any other activity during this period. The dog had special privileges throughout her time with him. She received 3 little pieces of cake every evening, and when he raised 3 fingers, she knew her evening treat was coming. Yet the extent of this obsession went far beyond simple affection for a pet. The dictator recounted instances of Blondie's intelligence, particularly her ability to retrieve a ball from under a cupboard using problem-solving skills. He expressed evident pride in what he considered her exceptional cleverness. During these sessions, he attempted to make Blondie howl on command. He would initiate a long, drawn-out howl himself, and the dog would join in on the high notes. The more he praised her performance, the louder she howled. He would then instruct her to howl in a lower register, mimicking actress Zara Leander, and Blondie would shift to a long, low howl. The obsession extended to breeding throughout the war. The Nazi leader was constantly looking for a suitable mate for Blondie. He chose a German shepherd named Harris, which belonged to Frau Professor Traudl and was actually a dog he had once given her as a present. However, Blondie took no notice of her potential mate. When Harris first tried getting closer, she bared her teeth furiously at him. The Führer was disappointed, but did not give up hope, saying he wanted to bring up a puppy one day. This obsession with his dog's breeding continued even as Germany collapsed around him. In the bunker during Berlin's final days in April 1945, he still discussed Blondie's phantom pregnancy. Sergeant Tornau, the dog walker, made the diagnosis. However, the dictator remained convinced that Blondie had simply gained weight from extra food and less exercise, deliberately deceiving them about her condition. The German leader refused to look at clocks despite having them readily available. A clock sat on his desk, yet he never glanced at it. He consistently asked his companions to tell him the time, even when carrying his gold spring-lidded watch in his trouser pocket. He repeatedly asked Schaub and Bormann for the time throughout each day, but would never check for himself. The reason for this behavior remains unclear. Observers speculated whether it stemmed from superstition, a calculated power play to command attention, or some deeper psychological compulsion. Regardless of the cause, the pattern remained consistent and peculiar. His physical environment reflected equally unusual preferences. The Nazi leader kept his study at 11 degrees Celsius, approximately 52 degrees Fahrenheit. His secretary, Traudl Junge, initially claimed she felt comfortable, but she soon regretted the statement. The cold became unbearable as dictation sessions continued. Generals and staff officers emerged from hours-long military briefings with red noses and blue hands, immediately consuming warming spirits afterward. General Jodl claimed to have contracted permanent rheumatism during these conferences. Yet the Führer remained comfortable at that temperature and never allowed it to rise. The German dictator preferred dim light because of his sensitive eyes. He insisted that ceiling lights be turned off wherever he worked. He wore sunglasses outdoors and kept his cap on even when being photographed because bright light dazzled him. He said he could not watch films during wartime to save his sensitive eyes for reading maps and reports, though this may have been an excuse for deeper reasons. He complained that reflections from window panes dazzled him at the tea house. In private, he wore an old-fashioned cheap pair of glasses with nickel-rimmed frames, but he hid this from public view, suggesting vanity. His clothing choices reflected either obsessive preference or complete disinterest. The Nazi leader wore the same outfit constantly throughout the war: black trousers, double-breasted field gray coat, white shirt, and black tie. His secretary never saw him in anything else. His jacket was perfectly plain with silver buttons but no braid or decorations, except the golden party badge, iron cross, and black decoration for the wounded. This uniformity suggests he showed no concern for variety in dress. The house remained quiet and seemingly abandoned during the morning hours. The dictator slept late, often not rising until 10 in the morning or later. Significant activity began only at noon. After visiting the tea house in the afternoon, he would retire to sleep until the evening military briefing. Despite claiming he slept poorly, he took regular afternoon naps. At the tea house, he would close his eyes and drift off to sleep after eating. Upon waking, he immediately rejoined whatever conversation was underway, as if he had merely closed his eyes while thinking. Night, by contrast, was when the Führer truly came alive. Tea parties continued until 4 or 5 in the morning. He never retired for the night before receiving confirmation that the Reich was clear of enemy aircraft. If any air raids were reported, he would pace restlessly until confirming Eva Braun was safe in Munich. Military conferences often lasted until 6 in the morning, followed by tea until 7. This schedule occasionally demanded the presence of others at inconvenient hours. The German leader would telephone associates late at night, summoning them to join him at the Café Heck in Munich. Those who received these calls had to get out of bed with no prospect of returning before 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The dictator sometimes apologized for these late summons, explaining that he had formed the habit of staying up late during the days of political struggle. After rallies, he would sit with the old fighters, and besides, his speeches usually stirred him up so much that he could not sleep before early morning. Food became another tool of psychological control during this period. The Reich's leader used graphic food descriptions to disgust others and manipulate their behavior. He would suddenly begin discussing the horrors of slaughterhouses during meals, describing in explicit detail young women in high rubber boots, standing in fresh blood. These descriptions made sensitive individuals, like the Reich press chief, set down their utensils, turn pale, and quietly claim they had lost their appetite. When disgust alone failed to control behavior, he resorted to outright fabrication. He told women that lipstick was made from fat skimmed off sewage in Paris, attempting to discourage them from something he could not actually forbid. The German dictator maintained a fanatical opposition to smoking throughout his entire life. In heated debates with Professor Blaschke, his dentist who smoked heavily. He declared smoking one of the most dangerous habits. He personally found the smell of cigar or cigarette smoke disgusting and refused to offer cigarettes to anyone he valued, believing he would be doing them no service. Furthermore, the Nazi leader claimed evidence proved that non-smokers lived longer than smokers and showed greater resistance to illness. He considered alcohol less harmful than nicotine, though everyone around him disagreed. In matters of art and entertainment, his tastes were equally rigid and revealing. The German leader owned hundreds of records in a built-in cupboard. Nevertheless, he nearly always had the same repertoire played during the war years. Operettas by Franz Lehár, songs by Richard Strauss, Hugo Wolf, and Richard Wagner dominated his listening. The only pop music he would allow others to play was the Donkey Serenade, which usually formed the conclusion of concerts. He insisted he possessed a perfect musical ear. When Eva Braun proved him wrong about a tune, the Nazi leader replied that the composer had written it incorrectly. He declared that if the composer had been as musical as himself, the composer would have written his version instead. The man who avoided marriage for most of his life became obsessed with arranging it for others. The Führer actively sought suitable wives for those around him. He believed his favorite liaison officer, Huell, should marry Eva's sister, Gretel Braun. When that did not work, he pointed toward Ilsebill Todt instead. He was disappointed that this suggestion was not enough to convince Huell, and could not understand why people would not marry when he recommended it. To Traudl Junge, the Nazi leader insisted she should marry Hans Junge immediately, claiming that once married, he could protect her if someone tried to pester her, but not if she remained only engaged. Control over women's appearance extended to everyone around him. The German leader noticed changes in the appearance of all the ladies and either admired or criticized them. Eva Braun was not allowed to change her hairstyle. When she tinted her hair darker or piled it up, he was horrified. He exclaimed that she looked totally strange and completely changed, like an entirely different woman. The dictator insisted women should have all their dresses made of the same material and in the same pattern. He complained about why women constantly needed to change their clothes, yet he personally noticed and commented on every fashion change among the women around him. Before the war, the Nazi leader's daily routine had been highly public. Gates at the Berghof opened once daily for his walk. Women took away stones that his foot had trodden on as souvenirs. A truck carrying bricks up to the Berghof was actually plundered by admirers, and the bricks ended up as precious keepsakes. During the later war years, however, secrecy about his presence became increasingly important. Windows of his train carriage were blacked out even in broad daylight. He lived by artificial light just as in his bunker. Only those in the know understood that a double guard on the chancellery entrances meant he was in residence. This growing isolation reached its peak at military headquarters, where he cut himself off completely from the outside world. Section 5. The Warlord at Headquarters. By early 1942, the German leader had left Berlin for a group of military headquarters hidden in forests and protected compounds. What began as a temporary wartime need became a self-chosen exile that would last for years. The Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, a group of bunkers and barracks surrounded by barbed wire and minefields, became his main home. Here, cut off from the German public and growing more separate from reality, his behavior grew stranger with each passing month. By mid-1942, the dictator had made a prediction about his future that would prove sadly true. He told Albert Speer in a bitter tone that one of these days he would have only 2 friends left. His voice carried such depths of loneliness that no promise of loyalty seemed right in response. That prediction would prove absolutely correct in ways no one expected at the time. During this period, meals at headquarters had become exercises in crushing silence. The contrast with earlier years was stark. Before, during dinners at the Chancellery, the German leader had controlled conversation with endless speeches about architecture, history, and his political views. Now, in the plain dining room at headquarters, deadly silence ruled. In silence, they ate their soup. While waiting for the next course, someone might make remarks about the weather. He would then say something mean about how bad the Weather Bureau was. The conversation would turn back to the quality of food. He remained very pleased with his diet cook, praising her skill at vegetarian cooking. If a dish seemed especially good, he asked guests to taste it, yet he was forever worried about gaining weight. He insisted that going around with a fat stomach would mean political ruin. After such remarks, he would call his assistant to remove tempting dishes before he could eat more. Throughout 1942 and 1943, his daily life at headquarters looked like nothing so much as prison life. The thick walls and ceilings of his bunker had the size of a cell. Iron doors and iron shutters guarded the few openings. Even his small walks within the barbed wire brought him no more fresh air and contact with nature than a prisoner's endless walk around the yard. His walk consisted of barely 100 yards within restricted Area Y, a small path that he walked repeatedly throughout each day. Dr. Morell had told him to take long walks, and it would have been easy to make paths in the nearby East Prussian woods. However, he stopped any such project. The result was this tiny path, walked over and over while he remained trapped within the compound. The barbed wire fence, the repeated walk in the compound, the iron doors, all of it created conditions impossible to tell apart from jail. Yet he had chosen this prison himself. Years later, in his own prison time, Albert Speer discovered what it meant to live under great mental pressure. Only then did he realize that the Führer's life had looked very much like that of a prisoner. The bunker existence, even during 1942 through 1944, had already taken on the quality of imprisonment long before the final days in Berlin. By 1943, his schedule grew more and more night-based and strange. Evening tea, to which he invited guests, even at headquarters, had been shifted to 2 o'clock in the morning and did not end before 3 or 4 o'clock. The time when he went to bed had shifted more and more into early morning. Albert Speer once said that if the war went on much longer, they would at least come around to the normal working hours of an early riser and take his evening tea as breakfast. He clearly suffered from not being able to sleep. He spoke of the pain of lying awake if he went to bed earlier. During tea, he would often complain that the day before he had only been able to grab a few hours of rest in the morning, after many hours of sleeplessness. Only the closest people were allowed at these teas: his doctors, secretaries, assistants, and the constant Bormann. They sat stiffly in uncomfortable armchairs while he tried to create a warm atmosphere with a fire in the fireplace. He passed cake to the secretaries with strong politeness and tried to give warmth to receive it in return. There was always something wrong about his attempts. Since music was banned at headquarters, there remained only conversation, with him doing most of the talking. His familiar jokes were acted like they were heard for the first time. His stories of hard youth or the days of struggle were listened to carefully, though everyone had heard them dozens of times before. The trivial nature of the topics showed that his anger level had become extremely low. Small matters led him back to a world where he could still give orders that worked. He could forget, for the moment at least, the powerlessness that bothered him since his enemies began shaping events. Even though he still acted like the master of the situation, elements of truth forced themselves into his awareness. At such moments during these late-night gatherings, he would return to his repeated words about being a politician against his will. Basically, he was an architect, but he had been unlucky. Only when he himself was head of government was the right kind of building possible. He expressed only one remaining wish. He wanted to hang the field gray jacket on its nail as soon as possible. When he ended the war victoriously, his life's task would be complete, and he would withdraw to the home of his old age in Linz, across the Danube. During late 1943, his constant interest in plans for the city of his retirement years slowly took on an escape quality. Hermann Giesler, the chief architect of Linz, was called to headquarters more and more often to present designs he barely ever asked for the Hamburg, Berlin, Nuremberg, or Munich plans anymore. When he thought about the suffering he now faced, he would say sadly that death could only mean a release for him. The obsession with his own tomb showed the depth of his depression. When he studied the Linz plans throughout this period, he would over and over turn to the sketches for his tomb, which was to be located in one of the towers of the Linz complex. Even after a winning war, he stressed, he did not want to be buried beside his field marshals in the Soldiers' Hall in Berlin. He wanted his tomb in Linz, overlooking the Danube, separate from everything. How often he studied these tomb designs during 1943 and 1944, while defeats grew on every front, spoke volumes about his mental state. Meanwhile, throughout these years, he refused to face the reality of what his decisions had caused. Albert Speer again and again tried to convince him to travel to bombed cities and let himself be seen there. Goebbels had tried the same thing, pointing with jealousy to Churchill's behavior. When Churchill visited bombed areas, the propaganda value was enormous. However, the German leader regularly brushed away any such suggestion. During his drives from Stettin station to the Chancellery or to his apartment in Munich, he now ordered his driver to take the shortest route. He formerly loved long detours to see the city. Now he avoided viewing the destruction. Speer went with him several times on such drives and saw with what lack of emotion he noted the new areas of rubble through which his car passed. The man who spent hours studying building models could not bear to see actual buildings reduced to ash. He had ordered the bombing campaigns that destroyed enemy cities. Now that German cities suffered the same fate, he simply looked away. In September 1943, his paranoia extended to everyone around him in a shocking way. Prince Philip of Hesse was invited to the headquarters that month. He was one of the few followers whom the dictator always treated with respect and politeness. Philip had arranged contacts with Italian fascism and helped purchase valuable artworks. He was related to the Italian royal house and had been useful for years. When the prince wanted to leave after a few days, the German leader bluntly told him he would not be allowed to go. He continued to treat Philip with outward courtesy and invited him to meals. However, members of the group, who had loved talking with a real prince, avoided him as if he had a contagious disease. On September 9th, Prince Philip and Princess Mafalda, the Italian king's daughter, were taken to a concentration camp on direct orders. For weeks afterward, he boasted that he had begun suspecting early that Prince Philip was sending information to the Italian royal house. He himself had kept an eye on him and ordered phone conversations recorded. By such methods, it had been discovered that the prince was passing number codes to his wife. Nevertheless, he had continued to treat Philip with marked friendliness. That had been part of his tactics, he declared, clearly delighted with his gifts as a detective. The arrest reminded all those close to him that they had put themselves completely into his hands. The feeling spread without words that he might be secretly keeping watch on anyone among his close friends, and might deliver them to a similar fate without giving the slightest chance to defend themselves. Trust had disappeared. Only fear remained. By autumn 1944, the effects of his lifestyle were becoming impossible to hide. Eyewitnesses describe a man changed beyond recognition. He appeared old, gray, and exhausted, with glassy eyes and shaking limbs. Compare this with newsreels from 1939, where he appeared relatively strong and energetic. The difference was stark and shocking. The final descent had begun. Soon, the man who had once commanded millions would command only a shrinking bunker complex in Berlin. The prophecy he had made in 1942, during those late-night conversations at headquarters, was about to come true in the ruins of the capital he had never finished building. Section 6. The Final Collapse. The trembling hand that signed orders in the Berlin bunker during April 1945 bore little resemblance to the energetic figure who had once hiked mountain paths and studied architectural models until dawn. The physical and mental deterioration of Adolf Hitler, which had begun years earlier, reached its inevitable conclusion in the underground rooms where he spent his final days. By 1939, even before the war's catastrophic toll became evident, the Nazi leader had already begun separating himself from the German people. The shift in the population's mood, the drooping morale felt throughout Germany, became evident in the necessity to organize cheering crowds where 2 years earlier the Führer had been able to count on spontaneity. More tellingly, he himself had moved away from the admiring masses. He tended to be angry and impatient when crowds on Wilhelmsplatz clamored for him to appear. 2 years before, he had often stepped out on the historic balcony. Now, he sometimes snapped at his adjutants when they came with requests that he show himself, telling them to stop bothering him with that. The separation took physical form in architectural planning. During this period, the Reich's leader made a revealing statement to Speer about the new Adolf Hitler plots. The difference was stark and shocking. The final descent had begun. Soon, the man who had once commanded millions would command only a shrinking bunker complex in Berlin. The prophecy he had made in 1942, during those late-night conversations at headquarters, was about to come true in the ruins of the capital he had never finished building. Section 6. The Final Collapse. The trembling hand that signed orders in the Berlin bunker during April 1945 bore little resemblance to the energetic figure who had once hiked mountain paths and studied architectural models until dawn. The physical and mental deterioration of Adolf Hitler, which had begun years earlier, reached its inevitable conclusion in the underground rooms where he spent his final days. By 1939, even before the war's catastrophic toll became evident, the Nazi leader had already begun separating himself from the German people. The shift in the population's mood, the drooping morale felt throughout Germany, became evident in the necessity to organize cheering crowds where 2 years earlier the Führer had been able to count on spontaneity. More tellingly, he himself had moved away from the admiring masses. He tended to be angry and impatient when crowds on Wilhelmsplatz clamored for him to appear. 2 years before, he had often stepped out on the historic balcony. Now, he sometimes snapped at his adjutants when they came with requests that he show himself, telling them to stop bothering him with that. The separation took physical form in architectural planning. During this period, the Reich's leader made a revealing statement to Speer about the new Adolf Hitler plots. He acknowledged it was not out of the question that he would someday be forced to take unpopular measures that might possibly lead to riots. They must provide for that eventuality. He insisted, all buildings on the square must be equipped with heavy steel bulletproof shutters over their windows. The doors must be of steel, and there should be heavy iron gates for closing off the square. It must be possible to defend the center of the Reich like a fortress. Speer unwittingly gave expression to this separation in his design for the dictator's palace facade. There was no opening in it except for the great steel entrance gate and a door to a balcony from which the German leader could show himself to the crowd. However, this balcony was suspended 5 stories high above the street. This frowning facade communicated an accurate image of the remote leader who had moved into realms of self-idolatry. The design revealed a man ready to have soldiers fire upon the populace, sealed away behind bulletproof glass and steel doors. Throughout the early war years, even as military disasters mounted, the Führer's disconnection from reality deepened through his architectural obsessions. On the evening after his brief morning visit to conquered Paris in June 1940, the Nazi leader received Speer in the small room of a peasant house and declared without preamble that a decree must be drawn up ordering full-scale resumption of work on the Berlin buildings. He then remarked that Paris was beautiful, but Berlin must be made far more beautiful. He continued with great calm, as if talking about the most natural thing in the world, that in the past he had often considered whether they would not have to destroy Paris. However, when they finished building in Berlin, Paris would only be a shadow. Therefore, why should they destroy it? This cool display revealed the Reich's leader could entertain the thought of wantonly annihilating the city he himself called the most beautiful in Europe, with all its priceless artistic treasures, simply because it might overshadow his own planned monuments. The contradiction captured his nature. Within a few days, some of the contradictions in the dictator's character revealed themselves to his architect. He contained a multitude of selves, from a person deeply aware of his responsibilities all the way to a ruthless and mankind-hating dictator. The physical decline became impossible to ignore during the war years. Around 1942, the German leader's health had deteriorated markedly from the vigorous mountain hiker of the 1930s. The chronic stomach problems that had plagued him for years worsened under the stress of military setbacks. Dr. Morell's injections increased in frequency, and the pharmaceutical cocktail expanded to include ever more dubious substances. The Führer's dependence on his physician had become absolute. Witnesses observed the transformation with growing alarm. The man who had once bounded upstairs now moved with visible effort. His hands developed a tremor that became more pronounced with each passing month. The formerly penetrating gaze grew clouded and unfocused. His complexion took on an unhealthy pallor despite the theatrical makeup applied for public appearances and film footage. The contrast between the propaganda image of the vigorous leader and the deteriorating reality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Throughout 1944, as military defeats mounted and Allied forces closed in from both east and west, the Nazi leader's mental state showed clear signs of breakdown. His rages, always a feature of his personality, became more frequent and less controlled. He would fly into fury over trivial matters, then sink into brooding silences that lasted for hours. The architectural fantasies that had once provided escape now seemed to mock him. Models of buildings that would never be constructed gathered dust in storage. Monuments to delusions that reality had demolished. The move to the bunker complex beneath the Reich Chancellery marked the final stage of isolation. The underground rooms, damp and poorly ventilated, became both fortress and tomb. Here, the routines that had structured life at Obersalzberg attempted to continue in grotesque parody. Meals were still served at irregular hours. Staff members still gathered for conferences that accomplished nothing. However, the appearance of normalcy could not survive in rooms that shook with each explosion from the Soviet artillery bombardment overhead. In these final weeks, the physical deterioration accelerated dramatically. The German leader's left hand shook uncontrollably. He dragged his left leg as he shuffled through the concrete corridors. His spine curved, forcing him into a perpetual stoop. The man who had once stood erect before hundreds of thousands now moved like someone decades older than his 56 years. Staff members who had not seen him for weeks were shocked by the transformation. The mental collapse mirrored the physical decline. In the bunker, the Führer alternated between grandiose plans for counteroffensives that existed only in his imagination and apocalyptic pronouncements about Germany's unworthiness to survive defeat. He pored over maps showing armies that had ceased to exist, issuing orders to divisions that had been destroyed weeks earlier. When presented with accurate reports of the situation, he would rage at his generals for their defeatism and supposed treachery. Yet even in these final days, the architectural obsession persisted. He discussed building plans with Speer during one of the architect's last visits to the bunker. The Nazi leader spoke of the monuments that would rise after final victory, describing details of structures that would never be built in a Reich that was already burning. The delusion sustained him even as Soviet shells turned his grand boulevard to rubble overhead. The marriage to Eva Braun on April 29, 1945, represented a final acknowledgement of reality, though characteristically performed in a manner that emphasized its futility. After years of maintaining the pretense of distance, after decades of keeping his relationship hidden, the dictator married his longtime companion with fewer than 48 hours of life remaining. The brief ceremony in the bunker conference room, witnessed by Goebbels and Bormann, formalized a relationship that the Führer had spent years denying. The following afternoon, April 30th, 1945, the Reich's leader retreated to his private rooms with his wife of one day. The details of what followed remained debated, but the outcome was certain. The man who had controlled the fate of millions, who had plunged Europe into catastrophic war, who had ordered the systematic murder of millions, ended his life in a concrete room beneath the ruins of his capital. The body was carried up the stairs to the Chancellery garden, placed in a shallow crater, doused with gasoline, and burned. The prisoner of routine had finally escaped his daily rituals. The architectural dreamer would build no more monuments. The disconnected leader who could not form genuine human bonds had severed his last connection to life itself. In death, as in life, the Nazi leader controlled the staging of his final act, denying his enemies the satisfaction of capture while ensuring his physical form would not become a trophy. The hidden Hitler was far stranger than the public image suggested. Behind the propaganda was a man with odd food obsessions, questionable medical treatments, boring daily routines, and growing isolation from reality. These private behaviors showed someone slowly falling apart physically and mentally. However, Hitler was not the only member of the Nazi inner circle living a deeply strange private life. Joseph Goebbels, one of his closest followers, had an even stranger life. Be sure to check that video next.